The bus jolted as it turned onto 3rd Avenue, tires cutting through the thin film of rain that slicked the road. City lights blurred on the window like watercolor amber, red, and a little blue from the passing siren. The night carried that gentle tiredness unique to a Tuesday. Too far from Monday to complain, too far from Friday to hope. Ethan Cole sat by the window, one arm resting against his worn messenger bag, the other clutching a small paper envelope, his daughter's drawings folded neatly inside. Every night after work, he stopped by the hospital to drop them off. Lily, 8 years old and brave in ways that broke him quietly, waited in a pale room under soft fluorescent light. The sketches were their way of pretending the world outside still belonged to them both. He glanced at his watch. 9:37 p.m. Late again. The factory had pushed overtime to cover a broken machine, and he'd stayed because he always stayed. There wasn't anyone else to take those hours. The bus hissed to a stop, and a cluster of passengers climbed aboard. Among them was a woman carrying a sleeping toddler pressed against her shoulder. The child's head, heavy with exhaustion, rested on her chest as if the whole world had stopped there. Ethan noticed the woman's eyes first red from crying, lashes wet with fatigue. Her hand trembled slightly as she tried to hold the strap and balance the child. No one moved. Rows of tired commuters stared at their phones, heads dipped under the hum of rain and neon. He stood up. "Take my seat," he said quietly. She looked up, surprised, as if kindness had become something foreign. "Oh, I can't. It's fine," she murmured. "It's okay," he insisted. "He's asleep. You'll both need it more than I do." She hesitated only a moment, then nodded gratefully. The toddler stirred as she sat down, the motion of the bus rocking him back into dreams. Ethan moved to stand by the door, gripping the cold metal bar. He tried not to watch her wipe her tears, tried not to wonder what kind of pain drove someone to cry on public transit. But compassion doesn't always ask for permission, it just happens, quietly, between strangers. "Thank you," she whispered as they neared the next stop. He smiled, small and tired. "Don't mention it." The bus braked with a sigh, doors opening to the sound of rain. She stepped out, holding her child close, and vanished into the blur of streetlights. Ethan watched her disappear down the block until she was only a shape against the storm. Then the doors closed, and the bus rolled on. By the time he reached his apartment, midnight had crawled into the city. The heater clicked and groaned in protest when he turned it on. The silence was almost a presence, soft, persistent. He unpacked his daughter's drawings on the table, a stick-figure family, a crooked sun, and the words, "For Daddy, I'll get better soon." He pressed the paper flat and ran a thumb along the edge. Then he folded it again and slipped it into his wallet beside her photo, Lily smiling in her hospital gown, missing front tooth proudly visible. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and patient. Ethan leaned against the window and let the city blur behind the glass. Somewhere down there, he thought, someone else was awake too, maybe the woman from the bus, maybe just another soul trying to keep something fragile alive. He didn't know that fate, quiet and deliberate, had already begun to move its pieces. Morning came pale and wet. Ethan left early, coffee in hand, coat buttoned against the drizzle. The factory was loud as always, machines coughing, belts whining, the smell of oil clinging to everything. He clocked in and took his place at the assembly line. The foreman barked orders. "Heads up, people management's visiting today. New ownership finalized last week. Try not to look like you hate being here." A few workers laughed. Ethan barely heard them. He was focused on the bolts, the hum of repetition that gave his thoughts somewhere safe to hide. By noon, the rain had stopped, but the air remained grey. The buzz spread fast, a black sedan pulling into the lot. Suits stepping out, umbrellas snapping open like crows. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and joined the line of workers as the plant manager hurried forward. Nerves visible, even behind his smile. The office doors opened, and she walked in. The woman from the bus. Her hair was tied neatly now, rain replaced by precision. The exhaustion was still there, but it hid behind composure, the kind built from long years of learning not to show weakness. Her eyes swept across the room, meeting faces that barely registered her surprise. Until they landed on his. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Recognition flickered between them like a flash of lightning in a dark field, brief, undeniable. The manager stepped forward. "Everyone, Please welcome our new CEO, Miss Harper Vale." Her voice was calm when she spoke, but something in her tone wavered barely, a ripple under glass. "Thank you. I'm looking forward to working with you all." Ethan's grip tightened on the rag. He felt the irony pulse through him, how the woman he'd offered his seat to, the one he'd watched cry under streetlight rain, now stood above the entire room, powerful, unreachable. She didn't acknowledge him then. Just one small glance, half a nod, but he saw the flicker of memory behind her eyes, the bus, the kindness, the silence. He looked down, pretending to wipe grease from his hands, but inside something stirred. A strange mixture of awe, confusion, and quiet disbelief. Sometimes fate doesn't announce itself. It just walks back into your life wearing a different face. The meeting went on. Orders were discussed, policies revised, schedules reshaped. Ethan hardly heard a word. All he could think of was that simple moment of compassion and how it had somehow led to this. When she finally left the room, her heels echoed across the concrete like a heartbeat fading into distance. Ethan exhaled slowly, still staring after her. The factory noise resumed, louder now, as if the world wanted to swallow the strangeness whole. But no amount of noise could drown what he felt. Somewhere deep down, a quiet question formed, half hope, half fear. What happens when the person you helped becomes the one who holds your future? Rain began again outside, soft and steady, tapping against the factory windows. Ethan looked up and couldn't help but smile. A little, because sometimes even the smallest kindness doesn't end on the bus. It follows you home, and sometimes it follows you to work. The rain had a way of making the city softer. Even its noise, usually sharp and restless, felt distant under the steady rhythm of water on concrete. Ethan liked mornings like this. They muted the chaos, made everything slower, almost bearable. He lived on the 5th floor of an aging apartment building that leaned a little to the left when the wind was strong. The wallpaper had peeled at the corners, and the elevator made a noise that could scare faith out of anyone who believed in machines. Still, it was home. He and Lily had filled it with warmth, a few hand-drawn pictures taped to the fridge, a small potted plant on the sill that refused to die, and a blanket that still smelled faintly of her shampoo. He moved through the morning quietly. Toast, instant coffee, and a quick shave over the sink. The reflection in the mirror showed a man in his 30s, with eyes too old for his age, tired, but not defeated. His hands bore small scars from years of factory work, each one a mark of doing what needed to be done. On the counter, his phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. "Lily's blood count looks better today. She's asking if you can bring her the blue sketchbook." Ethan smiled faintly. That sketchbook had become their secret project, a collection of dreams drawn in crayon and colored pencil. Every page was a wish, every doodle a piece of the future they both wanted. A backyard, a puppy, a day without IV drips or white coats. He tucked the sketchbook carefully into his bag before leaving. Outside, the city had already begun its daily sprint. Vendors shouted, taxis honked, and somewhere above, the early train groaned along its rails. Ethan walked with his usual rhythm, steady, focused, invisible. He stopped by the bakery on 4th, the one that always saved a small chocolate croissant for Lily. "For the little artist?" the old woman behind the counter asked, smiling. "Always," he said. It was small rituals like these that kept him grounded. A man could survive a lot, he'd learned, if he still had something or someone to bring breakfast to. By the time he reached the hospital, the rain had softened into drizzle. The pediatric ward smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper flowers. Lily sat up in bed, crayons scattered around her like a miniature battlefield. "Daddy!" she beamed. He knelt beside her, handing her the croissant and sketchbook. "Don't tell the nurses about the pastry," he whispered. She giggled. "I'll hide the crumbs." They spent an hour drawing together her favorite thing in the world. He sketched crooked trees. She added butterflies with too many wings. Every time he glanced at her, he saw traces of her mother. The dimple on her left cheek, the stubborn tilt of her smile. He didn't talk about her mother much. It wasn't because he didn't want to, it was because he couldn't. The accident had been 5 years ago. A night not unlike this one. Rain, headlights, and the kind of silence that never really ends. Since then, Lily had become his reason to keep breathing. When the nurse came in to check her IV, Ethan stepped aside, eyes lowered. He watched the nurse's gentle efficiency and felt that familiar ache, the helplessness of a parent who could fix everything in the world except what mattered most. He left after lunch, kissing Lily's forehead before walking back into the drizzle. At the factory, the mood had shifted since the new ownership. Rumors moved faster than machines. Some said there'd be layoffs. Others whispered about new benefits, better pay. Ethan didn't believe any of it. He'd learned long ago that hope was a currency most couldn't afford. Still, something about the new CEO unsettled him. Harper Vale. The name carried weight even before it entered his life. He'd seen her once before that night on a magazine cover in the corner store, holding an award for top young executives. But on the bus, she hadn't been that person. She'd been a mother on the verge of breaking. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The way she'd clutched her son, the quiet panic in her breathing. He'd seen that kind of grief before, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from holding everything together for too long. And now, she ran the company that kept food on his table. Life had a cruel sense of irony sometimes, but Ethan couldn't decide whether this was cruelty or grace. Maybe both. The day passed in rhythm, metal against metal, sweat against noise. But beneath the hum of work, his mind drifted. To the bus. To her. To the strange, almost sacred feeling of seeing someone's most human moment before the world puts their armor back on. When the shift ended, he stepped outside into fading light. The air smelled of wet pavement and exhaust. He lingered near the gate, watching as a sleek car pulled up to the curb. For a second, he thought he saw her inside a flash of auburn hair, a silhouette framed by tinted glass. He looked away quickly. Whatever this was, this thread fate had spun between them. It wasn't his to pull. He started walking home, but halfway across the lot, he heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Cole?" He turned. It was the foreman, awkward and slightly winded. "The new CEO asked for you," he said. "Personally." Ethan blinked. "Me?" "Yeah." Said she wanted a word. "Upstairs office." The foreman shrugged, already turning back toward the building. "You're either getting fired or promoted. Guess you'll find out." Ethan stood still for a moment, the rain tapping lightly on his jacket. Then he looked toward the office windows, glowing faintly through the mist. And somewhere inside those lights, he knew she was waiting. He wasn't sure if it was fear or fate pulling him forward, but he went anyway, because sometimes life doesn't knock. It just calls your name when you least expect it. Harper Vale had learned long ago that silence was a currency. In boardrooms, it bought respect. In negotiations, it bought fear. But in her private life, it only bought loneliness. Her office at Vale Manufacturing looked like a glass cage, the skyline spread out before her, the city's veins pulsing with traffic and light. From here, she could almost forget the feeling of being small, of being powerless. Almost. A half-empty coffee cup sat beside her laptop. She hadn't touched it in hours. The rain had returned, soft against the window, each drop a tiny reminder that the world outside still breathed. But Harper's world rarely did. It ran on schedules, spreadsheets, and expectations that never slept. She had been CEO for only 3 days, inheriting the company after her father's sudden heart attack. The board had called it a smooth transition, but behind their polite smiles, she knew what they really meant. "We don't think you're ready." Maybe they were right. Her son, Oliver, was asleep in the office nursery down the hall. He was 5, small, tender-hearted, and too perceptive for his age. Since the divorce, he'd been quieter, clinging to her whenever she left for work, whispering things like, "Don't get lost again, Mummy." Last night had been her breaking point. She'd picked him up from her mother's house after a day of endless meetings, traffic, and press interviews. He'd fallen asleep on the bus ride home and she'd cried, quietly, thinking no one noticed. But someone had. She could still see him in her memory, the man who gave up his seat without hesitation. There had been no pity in his eyes, only kindness. The kind that disarmed her. The kind she hadn't felt in years. She didn't even get his name. And yet, when she walked into the factory that morning and saw his face again, grease-stained hands, eyes that held both exhaustion and warmth, something inside her shifted. The universe, it seemed, had a strange sense of humor. Now, as she sat behind her desk, she reread the employee report in front of her. Ethan Cole, machine operator, 10 years of service, no disciplinary record, widowed, One child, age 8. Her throat tightened at that last detail. A knock came at the door. Her assistant peeked in. "Ma'am, Mr. Cole is here." Harper straightened slightly. "Send him in." The door opened, and Ethan stepped inside, wiping his hands nervously on his uniform. He looked out of place in the sleek glass office, like a working man had accidentally wandered into the wrong movie. "Miss Vale," he said, voice cautious but steady. "Mr. Cole," she greeted, gesturing toward the seat opposite her desk. "Please, sit." He hesitated, then did. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The rain filled the silence like background music. "I wanted to thank you," she began, finally meeting his eyes. "For what you did last night." He blinked. "On the bus?" She nodded. "I was not in a good place. You didn't know me, but you noticed. That means more than you realize." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. It was just a seat. Her lips curved slightly. There are no justs when it comes to kindness. The words hung between them, fragile but sincere. He looked at her for a long moment, unsure how to respond. She looked different here, poised, distant, her grief dressed in professionalism. But behind that, he could see the same woman from the bus. Tired eyes, quiet strength. "I read your file," she said softly. "Your daughter's name is Lily?" He nodded. "Yeah, she's been in the hospital for a while." Something flickered in her expression, sympathy, but also understanding. "My son's been struggling too. Different reasons, but still." Ethan nodded again, unsure what to say. Compassion felt heavier when it came from people who could afford to hide it. "I'm not calling you here for any official reason," she continued. "I just wanted to see you again. To thank you properly." He gave a faint smile. "Guess fate's got a strange sense of humor." Her eyes softened. "It does." For a moment, the office didn't feel like an office anymore. It felt like two people standing in the rain again, strangers bound by something wordless and human. Then the intercom buzzed. "Miss Vale, the board is ready for you." She exhaled, the warmth in her face retreating back behind the CEO mask. "Duty calls." Ethan stood. "I'll get back to work." As he turned to leave, she said quietly, "Mr. Cole?" He looked back. "If you ever need anything," she said, "you know where to find me." He hesitated. "Same goes for you." Her smile was brief but real. "Thank you." When the door closed behind him, Harper leaned back in her chair, staring at the faint reflection of the rain on the glass. She hadn't expected to feel this, whatever this was. Recognition, perhaps, or the ache of two lives that had brushed once and shouldn't have again. But destiny rarely asks for permission. She looked at her son's photo on the desk. In it, he was smiling, a chocolate smudge on his cheek. The picture was old, taken before everything had gone wrong, before her husband's betrayal, before her father's death, before the world demanded she become steel. Now, there was a man downstairs who reminded her of something she'd lost long ago. Simplicity. The kind of goodness that didn't need witnesses. Outside, the rain kept falling, and somewhere deep inside her, beneath all the noise and responsibility, Harper Vale felt something thaw. The week passed with the slow rhythm of uncertainty. Every day the rain seemed to threaten, hanging heavy in the grey sky, never quite letting go. The city moved as it always did, hurrying, colliding, forgetting, but inside Vale Manufacturing, something subtle had shifted. Ethan felt it in the hallways. The way people talked softer when Harper Vale walked by. The way every machine suddenly seemed to behave when she was near. She didn't rule with fear. Not exactly. It was something quieter. Authority born from exhaustion and empathy. He tried to stay invisible. He'd had enough attention already with that strange meeting in her office. Still, sometimes he caught her glancing down from the mezzanine, her eyes pausing on him before she turned away. He didn't know if it meant anything. Maybe she was just trying to understand the man who'd seen her at her lowest. Maybe it was nothing at all. Thursday evening brought a storm. By 6, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and thunder rolled low across the city. The foreman had dismissed most of the workers early for safety, but Ethan stayed behind to finish recalibrating one of the conveyor belts. He always stayed behind. When the lightning flickered outside, the lights blinked once, twice, then steadied. He wiped his hands on a rag and turned toward the exit, ready to head to the hospital before visiting hours ended. That's when he heard the sound. A child's cry. Faint, muffled by the wind. He froze. The sound came again from near the storage corridor. He ran toward it, the echo of his boots swallowed by the storm. There, crouched near the door, was a small boy, 5, maybe 6 years old, curled against the wall, crying softly. "Hey," Ethan said gently, kneeling down. "Hey, buddy, what you doing here?" The boy looked up, startled, cheeks streaked with tears. I can't find Mommy." Ethan recognized the face instantly. The photo on Harper's desk. Her son, Oliver? He asked. The boy blinked, surprised. "You know my name?" He smiled softly. "Your mum told me about you." Lightning flashed, followed by a deep rumble. The building trembled slightly as the storm intensified. Ethan took off his jacket and draped it over the boy's shoulders. "Let's get you back to her, yeah?" Oliver sniffled. "She was in a meeting. And I was drawing. Then I heard thunder." "I don't like thunder." "I don't either," Ethan said. "But it's just the sky talking loud. It'll quiet down soon." The boy managed a small nod. Ethan picked him up, the child's arms instinctively wrapping around his neck. As he carried him through the factory's dim corridor, the smell of metal and oil mixed with the damp scent of rain blowing in through the side doors. When they reached the office wing, Harper appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression breaking from composure into panic and relief all at once. "Oliver!" she cried, rushing down. "Mummy!" Ethan set the boy down just as she reached them. She dropped to her knees, hugging her son tight, her hands trembling as she checked his face, his arms. "Oh my God, I thought I didn't know where you went." Oliver clung to her neck. "I got scared." She looked up at Ethan, eyes glassy with gratitude and guilt. "You found him?" He nodded quietly. "He was near the storage hall, probably wandered off during the thunder." She swallowed hard, exhaling a shaky breath. "Thank you. Again." "It's nothing," he said. "Just glad he's safe." Lightning cracked again, closer this time, shaking the glass. Without thinking, Ethan reached out, steadying her by the elbow. She didn't pull away. For a second, their faces were inches apart, two people from different worlds, both caught in the same storm. "Let's get you both out of here," he said softly. She nodded. The drive to the parking garage was slow. Sheets of rain blurred the windshield. Harper insisted on giving him a ride since he'd missed his bus waiting out the storm. Oliver was asleep in the back seat, the steady rhythm of the rain lulling him into dreams. For the first time in a long while, the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was gentle. "He's a good kid," Ethan said. "He's all I've got," she murmured. "And sometimes I feel like I'm failing him." "You're not," he said quietly. "He just needs you to keep showing up. That's what matters." She glanced at him, her face softened by the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "You sound like someone who knows." He smiled faintly. "I've had practice." The car turned onto the main road. Thunder rolled again, fading into the distance. "Ethan," she said after a pause, "why did you stay at the factory tonight?" "Everyone else went home." "Old habits," he said. "I don't like leaving things half done." Her lips curved slightly. "That's rare." He shrugged. "When you don't have much, you learn to hold on to the little you can finish." She didn't answer right away. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. The wipers swished back and forth, each stroke whispering something unspoken between them. When they reached his building, she parked under the awning. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. "Thank you," she said softly. "For helping him. For helping me." He opened the door, then paused. "You don't have to thank me. Just take care of him." Her voice dropped, almost a whisper. "You already know I will." Their eyes met one last time through the soft hum of rain. Then he stepped out, closing the door gently. As she drove away, her reflection flickered briefly in the rearview mirror, a woman who had spent years building walls, now unsure how to rebuild what she'd lost inside them. And Ethan stood under the awning, watching the taillights fade into the mist. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, the rain didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. It felt like something beginning. The storm passed overnight, leaving the city washed clean and silent. Morning sunlight spilled across the streets, catching in puddles that mirrored fragments of sky. For most, it was just another Friday. For Ethan, it felt like the world had shifted barely, but undeniably. He woke early, as always. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked pavement. He moved through his routine with mechanical calm. Kettle, toast, jacket. But something about the night before wouldn't leave him. The image of Harper kneeling in the dim corridor, holding her son, her composure undone, it stayed. He had seen her, not as a CEO, not as a face from glossy magazines, but as a mother, terrified of losing the only thing that mattered. That moment had changed something in him. Maybe it had changed something in her, too. By noon, the factory was buzzing again. The storm had flooded part of the loading dock, and the crew was scrambling to dry and reset equipment. Ethan worked quietly, sleeves rolled, movements efficient. A few co-workers approached him, curious. "Hey, Cole, is it true the new CEO knows you?" one asked, grinning. "People saw her drop you off last night." Ethan frowned. "She gave me a ride, that's all." "Sure," another teased. "Next thing we know, you'll be running this place." He didn't reply. The factory's noise swallowed their laughter. He kept his focus on the task, but under his calm, a strange unease brewed. He didn't like being seen not this way. The attention felt wrong, like standing in a spotlight he never asked for. At lunch, he slipped outside to the back alley where it was quiet. The air still carried the smell of rain and oil. He leaned against the wall and pulled out his phone. A missed call from the hospital. His pulse quickened. He called back immediately. The nurse's voice came soft and calm. "Don't worry, Mr. Cole, it's good news. Lily's test results improved. Doctor says she's stable enough for discharge soon." For a second, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. "Thank you," he managed finally. He hung up and stared at the grey clouds drifting above the city skyline. It felt like the first light after a long tunnel, fragile, unreal. He wanted to tell someone, but there was no one. Almost no one. That evening, Harper sat in her office long after the staff had gone home. The glass walls glowed with the last traces of sunset, the city beyond shifting from gold to indigo. Oliver was asleep again on the couch, a blanket tucked up to his chin. She'd spent the day buried in board meetings, performance reports, and polite resistance from men twice her age, who still saw her as her father's daughter instead of her own woman. She'd smiled through all of it, the mask firmly in place. But when she closed her laptop now, the quiet pressed in. She found herself thinking about Ethan. The steadiness in his voice when he'd found Oliver. The way he never asked for thanks. The way he seemed to carry the weight of something invisible, and still kept walking. She stood and walked toward the window. Down below, the factory lights flickered in neat lines, small constellations against the dark. Somewhere down there, he was probably finishing another shift, hands stained with the same grease that made her company's profits possible. It struck her then how easily she'd built her life on the backs of people she'd never met, never seen, and how strange it felt now to have seen one so clearly. On her desk, she opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, his file again. She read the small notes at the bottom. Works overtime without complaint, declines bonuses, daughter in long-term pediatric care. She closed the file slowly, as if handling something sacred. Then she picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. "Carla," she said, "find out which hospital his daughter's at, and send flowers but don't sign my name." "Understood," came the reply. She hesitated. "Actually, add a sketchbook too. Something new." When she hung up, she felt something warm unfurl in her chest, not pride, not pity, but a quiet gratitude, a sense that maybe she'd been given a chance to give back what she'd once lost. The next day, Ethan walked into Lily's room to find a bouquet waiting on the table. White lilies, wrapped in soft blue paper, and a small box beside them. Inside was a brand new sketchbook, the kind with thick pages and a ribbon marker. The card read only, "For Lily, keep dreaming." No signature. Lily grinned. "Did you get these, Daddy?" He shook his head. "No, sweetheart. I think someone else wanted you to have them." "Someone nice?" "The nicest," he said quietly. She opened the sketchbook and began drawing immediately a house. 2 stick figures under a big yellow sun. When she finished, she turned it toward him. "That's us," she said proudly. And look, Mummy's in the clouds watching. He swallowed hard. It's beautiful. She smiled, radiant and pure. Maybe someday we can live in a house like that. He brushed her hair back gently. Maybe we will. As he left the room later, he caught sight of the nurse, placing a note in the bin, the flower delivery slip. He glanced at it briefly and froze when he saw the sender's address. Vale Corporate Office. Harper. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like the world was divided between those who gave orders and those who followed them. Sometimes, he thought, kindness didn't care about rank. That night, he sat by the window again, the city lights stretching endlessly below. He thought about her, about how strange it was that two lives, so far apart, had crossed in the smallest act of compassion. He wondered if she knew what her gesture had meant. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring: layoffs, promotions, indifference. But for now, it didn't matter. For now, it was enough that his daughter was smiling again, that the storm had passed, and that somewhere, in a glass office above the city, someone else might be smiling too. The Monday that followed began like any other. Cold wind swept through the streets, carrying the hum of early traffic and the distant clang of construction. But something in the air felt charged, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Ethan arrived at the factory before dawn, thermos in hand, collar turned up against the chill. The flood damage was mostly repaired, and the day's orders were stacked high. Routine, he told himself. Ordinary. That's how he preferred things. But by mid-morning, word spread again. This time it wasn't rumor, it was official. The new CEO, Miss Harper Vale, was coming down to the floor for an inspection. No one could remember the last time a Vale had walked the factory aisles in person. Workers cleaned the stations, wiped machines, straightened uniforms. The energy was half fear, half awe. Ethan tried to stay focused, tightening bolts, checking gauges, but part of him, the part that remembered her trembling hands in the hospital hallway, the sound of her voice saying thank you, couldn't stop replaying that night. She wasn't supposed to come here. Not again. Not into his world. When the elevator doors slid open, a hush fell. Harper stepped out, surrounded by a small entourage of executives. The sharp echo of her heels cut through the steady hum of machinery. She wore black, a fitted suit that carried power like an aura, but her eyes held something softer, quieter, almost searching. She stopped occasionally to greet workers, to ask brief questions about processes she already knew from reports, but Ethan could tell her attention wasn't really on the machines. She was looking for something, or someone. It didn't take long. Their eyes met across the line. The noise of the factory receded like a tide. For a heartbeat, they just stood there, two people in a crowd of dozens, suddenly alone in recognition. Harper excused herself from her assistant and walked toward him. The murmur of whispers followed her like ripples in still water. "Mr. Cole," she said when she reached him, her tone even but her eyes uncertain. "May we speak privately?" He nodded, silent, wiping his hands on a rag before following her toward the back office. The room was small, walls lined with old blueprints and metal shelves. She closed the door behind them, the sound echoing like punctuation. For a moment, neither spoke. "I wanted to thank you again," Harper began quietly, "for what you did that night. For Oliver." Ethan shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." She shook her head. "No. Most people wouldn't have noticed." "You did." He didn't answer. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You didn't just give me your seat. You gave me back a piece of myself I thought I'd lost. I was drowning in this job, in expectations, in grief. You reminded me what humanity looks like when it's stripped of titles." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor. "You don't owe me anything. I'm not here to repay you," she said softly. "I'm here because I don't want that night to stay a coincidence." That made him look up. "What do you mean?" She hesitated and then, in a rare act of vulnerability, told him the truth she'd buried for years. About her husband's death in the car accident she blamed herself for. About the years she'd spent pretending she was fine because she thought CEOs didn't have the luxury of breaking. About the guilt that had followed her like a shadow. "And then," she said, voice trembling slightly, "I saw you. Alone, tired, carrying your own world on your shoulders and still giving up your seat for someone else. I realized maybe I didn't have to keep pretending." Ethan's throat felt tight. He wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he said, "We all carry something. We just learn different ways to hide it." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "You sound like someone who's had to." He nodded. "My wife passed when Lily was 3. Some nights, I still set out 2 plates before I remember." Silence filled the room, heavy but tender. Harper exhaled slowly. "You said Lily, right? The girl at Street Mary's?" His head jerked slightly. "How do you—" She raised a hand. "The flowers. And the sketchbook. I sent them." He stared at her, stunned. "Why?" Her answer was simple. "Because she reminded me of Oliver. Because you reminded me of what it means to care. Even when it hurts." He swallowed, the emotion raw and unguarded. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "That's why I did." Outside the small window, the city shimmered glass towers rising from the wet streets, sunlight scattering in fractured brilliance. Harper turned to face him fully. "Ethan, I have an offer." "Not out of pity. Out of respect." He frowned. "I want you to manage the new community outreach program we're launching. It's about connecting the company's profits to people, real people like you. You'd be leading something that matters." He blinked, caught between disbelief and awe. I'm not qualified for that." Her smile softened. "Neither was I, once." For a long time, he said nothing. Then quietly, "What if I say no?" "Then you'll still have my respect," she said. "And my gratitude. Always." He met her gaze steady, unflinching. And for the first time since his wife's death, he felt seen, not as a worker or a single father or a man struggling to make ends meet, but as someone who mattered. When Harper left the factory, the workers whispered again, curious. But Ethan stayed still, hands resting on the cold metal railing, heart unsteady. Outside, the clouds began to break. Sunlight slipped through, slow and golden, touching the city like forgiveness. He didn't know if he'd accept the offer. He didn't know what it would mean. But he knew this. The woman he'd met by chance, the crying stranger on a crowded bus, had just rewritten the story of his life. And somehow, fate had found a way to bring them both back to the same place. Changed. 3 months later, spring arrived, shy, uncertain, as if testing whether the city had room left for warmth. In the factory courtyard, saplings bent under pale sunlight. New leaves, bright and fragile, quivered in the breeze. The air smelled faintly of rain, and metal the scent of things beginning again. Ethan watched from the window of a small second-floor office that hadn't existed when he started working here. The brass plate on the door read, "Community Programs, Ethan Cole, Director." He still wasn't used to it. The title, the desk, the way people called him Sir now. Some days it felt like he was wearing someone else's clothes. But when he looked around at the job fair flyers on the wall, at the donation box filled with art supplies for children's hospitals, it made sense. This wasn't power, it was purpose. And it had started with a single act of kindness on a crowded bus. Harper kept her promise. She'd built the outreach department from scratch, insisted Ethan lead it, and defended the idea against every skeptical board member. He hadn't accepted easily. He'd hesitated for weeks, torn between fear of change and the quiet belief that he could do more. In the end, it was Lily who'd made the decision for him. "Mummy would want you to," she'd said one evening, sitting cross-legged on their worn couch. "You always tell me that helping people makes us feel bigger, not smaller." He'd smiled, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Then we'll try." Now, every morning, he brought Lily's drawings to pin on the wall, bright bursts of colour amid corporate grey. Harper visited the department often, though never with the same entourage that used to trail her. She came alone now, her steps lighter, her laughter easier. The first time she'd dropped by, Ethan had noticed something different. The hard edges around her had softened. Her smile reached her eyes again. "Oliver loves his new school," she'd said, watching Lily's sketchbook lying open on his desk. "He says he wants to draw like her someday." "She'll teach him," Ethan had replied. "She's good at sharing." That became their rhythm, quiet visits, coffee shared over planning meetings that often turned into long conversations about life, grief, second chances. They talked about the loneliness that came after loss, the strange guilt of surviving, and the small mercies that helped them endure. Sometimes, She'd stand by the window, looking out at the city below. "It's strange," she once said. "You spend your whole life trying to climb higher, and when you finally do, you realize everything that matters is still on the ground." He'd smiled faintly. "That's where people live, and where you found me," she'd added, voice low. Neither said anything after that. The silence was enough. One Thursday afternoon, Ethan was helping load donations when he heard laughter echoing from the hallway. Lily's laughter. She came running toward him, a small whirlwind of curls and color. Behind her was Harper, holding Oliver's hand. "Daddy!" Lily shouted. "Look who came to visit!" Ethan blinked in surprise. "Oliver, hi there. You're getting taller every time I see you." Oliver grinned shyly. "Mum said I could help." "Help with what?" Lily held up a crayon sketch poster. "Family Fun Day, charity for kids." Harper smiled. They planned it together. "Apparently, they're better at teamwork than most of our board." Ethan chuckled. "Wouldn't doubt it." The four of them spent the rest of the afternoon setting up tables, blowing balloons, and unpacking boxes of art supplies. The children painted, laughed, and ran between the tables while the adults worked side by side, two single parents, two stories rewritten by loss and grace. At one point, Harper paused, watching Ethan crouched beside Lily, helping her tie a ribbon around a donation jar. The sunlight caught his profile steady, gentle, alive, and she thought, this is what rebuilding looks like, not the glass towers or the quarterly reports. But this a man teaching his daughter that kindness can build empires, invisible to the eye. That night, after everyone had gone, Ethan and Harper stayed behind to clean up. The air smelled of paper, sugar, and faint laughter left behind by children. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "Every day," he admitted. "Not because of what happened, but because of what came after." She nodded slowly. "I used to believe fate was cruel, that it took things just to remind us how powerless we are. And now I think it brings back what we've lost, just not in the way we expect." He met her eyes steady, open. "Harper," he said after a pause, "you changed everything for me." She smiled gently. "No, you did that yourself. I just showed up where kindness led me." They stood in silence, surrounded by half-deflated balloons and fading light. The city, beyond the glass, shimmered 1,000 windows, glowing like stars. Maybe this was what destiny looked like. Not grand gestures or lightning strikes, but two people, standing in the quiet aftermath of pain, finally ready to live again. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like a man waiting for life to return. He was already living it. Spring deepened into early summer. The city had traded its grey for gold, windows open, streets alive, laughter spilling from cafes. The air was full of small sounds of life continuing, stubbornly, beautifully. Ethan stood outside the community centre, his centre now watching Lily and Oliver chase bubbles across the courtyard. Harper sat nearby, cross-legged on the stone ledge, her hair pulled back loosely, a coffee in one hand and quiet peace in her eyes. She looked lighter these days, not because the weight of her job had vanished, but because she'd learned how to carry it differently. With grace, with balance. Ethan walked over and handed her a folder. "The board approved the next program," he said. "Hospital art therapy for kids." Her smile was soft but proud. "That was your idea." "It was Lily's, actually," he said. "She said the kids there needed more colors in their days." "Smart girl," Harper murmured. "Takes after her father." Ethan laughed quietly. "She's got her mother's heart. I just get to keep it beating." They sat in silence for a while, watching the children play under the wide summer sky. There was something profoundly simple in the moment. No titles, no power, no distance. Just two parents, two survivors, anchored in the same quiet gratitude. "I used to think life owed me an apology," Harper said after a while, "for everything it took, for how much it hurt. And now?" he asked. "Now I think it just kept trying to give me new beginnings. I was too busy grieving the old ones to notice." Ethan nodded. "Maybe that's what second chances are. They don't come dressed like miracles. Sometimes they just look like a seat on a bus." She turned to him, eyes glinting with that gentle, knowing warmth. "Or like someone willing to give it up." He smiled. "Guess that worked out okay." They both laughed quietly, like people who had learned to measure joy in whispers, not shouts. When the children tired out, Harper and Ethan walked them home together. Their steps matched naturally, like they'd been walking the same path for years without realizing it. As they reached the corner where their street split, Harper paused. The late sun painted the world in soft gold. She looked at him, then at the kids tugging at their hands. "Strange, isn't it?" she said. "How a moment of kindness can change the shape of everything after it." Ethan nodded. "Yeah. Like dropping a pebble into still water, you never really see how far the ripples go." She smiled. "Maybe that's why they call it grace." They stood there for a long time, not saying goodbye, not needing to, just letting the quiet between them speak all the words they didn't need to find. Eventually, she turned to go, her son's hand in hers. Ethan watched them walk away until they disappeared into the warm light. Lily slipped her hand into his. "Daddy," she said softly, "do you think we'll see them again?" He looked down at her small face glowing in the sunset. "I think," he said, "fate's already decided that." She grinned, satisfied, and skipped ahead. Ethan lingered a moment longer, eyes tracing the horizon. He thought of that crowded bus, the crying woman, the simple instinct that had made him stand up, not knowing that it would lead him here, to this version of his life. He smiled. Kindness, he thought, wasn't about what it cost. It was about what it opened doors, hearts, possibilities. Sometimes it even rewrote destinies. And as the last light slipped behind the skyline, he whispered to the quiet city below, "Kindness leaves echoes that power can't erase." Then he turned toward home. In a world obsessed with titles and walls, it's the smallest gestures that bridge the widest distances. A seat given, a hand offered, a heart reopened. Kindness doesn't wait for recognition, it simply finds its way back in ways we never expect. Where are you watching from? If stories like this touch your heart, subscribe for more cinematic tales of fate, love, and redemption.